47 member states. Nevertheless, we have seen a growing number of so-called gray zones where the government is de facto not in charge and therefore no protection under the convention and by the court is given to all these people. Especially you as Human Rights Commissioner would, I believe, be very much needed over there, because there are the places where probably human rights are violated most. Do you have, Madam Commissioner, a strategy how to enter one way or another in all these gray zones in order to protect all citizens of Europe and not only those who are under a de facto government? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cox. I will now give the Commissioner the opportunity to answer this first initial round of questions on behalf of the political groups before we go on to the speaker list. Mrs. Mijatović.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for all very interesting and important questions. I will try to group it in case there is a repetition. First, Mr. Schwabe, your question in relation to migrants and the situation in Greece. As you probably know, since my appointment, I visited Greece twice, and I also had the opportunity to go to the islands, in particular, to Lesbos, to Moria camp, and also I was there twice, and also to Samos, and camps also in the mainland. I had extensive discussions with the government, previous government of Greece, current government of Greece in relation to migration issues, and I agree. Greece is in a very difficult situation. There is a problem that I raised on many occasions, and this is an issue that is quite, I would say, embarrassing thing for the Council of Europe member states, and unwillingness to show more solidarities to the countries like Greece, Italy, Malta, that are on the forefront when it comes to migration problems. Nevertheless, even with this particular challenge that Greece and many other states are facing, there is also need to protect human rights of migrants, and this is a huge challenge nowadays. When it comes to a particular situation, I would say in Lesbos, I'm concerned about living conditions there prevailing in the new facility set up following the fire. This is something that we do follow. Reports point to limited access to sanitation, heavy rains also provoking infiltrations in the tents. And in this context, I'm puzzled by the Greek authorities' decision to close two well-functioning reception facilities run by municipality and civil society volunteers. So this is an issue that these closures also raise more generally the question of the conditions in which non-state actors operate in the Aegean islands. And this is something that we will need to continue monitoring and working, not only when it comes to Greece, but also many other member states, particularly if we talk about the global situation when it comes to migration, willingness of the states, and then also the issue of racism that is unfortunately very much present in many of our member states. Now moving to racism and the situation in Germany and many other states, particularly when it comes to police violence, then ethnic profiling. I would say that any kind of report is welcome. This is something that could help all of us working in order to tackle human rights violation. With my team, I dedicated quite an amount of time in looking at the police violence, and we will follow soon with some more information and more reports in relation to this. I issued last year a human rights comment on ethnic profiling, which also shows the situation that is quite problematic in our member states, and anything that can be of help to our work by providing us with the statistical reports by Germany or any other member states would be of great importance. When it comes to this problem, we are also in touch with other organizations dealing with it, particularly with FRA, that provides specific data and information on, and also the applications that are used in order to do ethnic profiling and any kind of profiling that can be in violation of human rights. Now, Belarus, that is in a way for a human rights commissioner easy topic, but not easy because Belarus is, I would say, still not member states of the Council of Europe. You mentioned death penalty. On this, I mean, my view is very clear. I mean, if they want to become a member state of the Council of Europe or any other state, you know, that is something that is unacceptable in democracies. But the situation is not that simple and that easy by ticking one box that you would solve many problems. We also know that many current member states are facing quite challenges in many issues that are in relation to human rights, but also compliance with the convention, and not to mention execution of the judgments and many other things that, in a way, we were all hoping the moment states become members, they will really move in a direction to do more. I have made a statement on Belarus where I point out the grave human rights violations, ill treatment of people detained and imprisoned, which is something of great importance, but also of a great concern of me and my office. I know Belarus quite well as a country. In my previous position, I visited the country on many occasions. Civil society is amazing, courageous, outspoken people that need assistance and help from the Council of Europe and many other international organizations. But of course, that's not enough. Enough would be further engagement with Belarus in order to try to find the right way of engagement and not leaving citizens and civil society without any hope and engagement of the Council of Europe. As a main human rights body in Europe, we have particular obligation, and I know that our Secretary General, President of PACE, and many others are very eager to find the right way of engagement. When it comes to my office, it goes without saying that this is something that will continue. Now, Ms. Petra Stenen, the Istanbul Convention and the reluctance. It's I would say, a social phenomenon. It is quite a dangerous trend. In many of my visits, I address the issue of reluctance of the ratification of Istanbul Convention with many officials, even in the states that ratified and now they are trying to move back or to distance themselves from Istanbul Convention. I heard many quite embarrassing replies in relation to the reason for reluctance, like that's part of our culture, it's taboo. But then my question is always, which kind of culture, which kind of tradition actually gives you right to, beat your wife or your partner? This is something, that is quite basic, I would say, when it comes to human rights. But it is used by many, unfortunately, by many Council of Europe member states and governments in question that are refusing to ratify and also to move forward in implementing certain laws. And it's showing in which kind of society we live in. Pandemic just, as I said, made like a magnifying glass in order to show and to expose problems even more than they are already present. But at the same time, this should also give more responsibility or for all of us working with the states. And when it comes to my role, I can only assure you that I will continue working on this and trying to make sure that we move forward with the ratifications, but not just ratifications for the sake of ratifying it, but also implementation and working and educating society in order to explain why this is something that we should not accept in democracies and in 21st century. There is a need to explain, but sometimes I also see that there is a lot of political manipulation before the elections, during elections, in order to steer the wheel of certain prejudice and stereotypes in our society. So the root causes are there of masculinity, as you put it, but also misogynist speech and everything that goes together with this. And this is a fight that we need to, in a way, do together. And when I say together, I mean men and women. This is not something that only women should be raising and fighting for. This is an issue of the well-being of the society, of the well-being of families and citizens of all Council of Europe member states, and of course, when it comes to migrants and people coming from the states where there are different views on the role of women in the society, it is also crucial to put more effort. The governments, the parliaments should put more effort in integration programs, in educating, in making sure that there is a full understanding of human rights obligations, of the importance of human rights obligations. And on many issues, when it comes to migration and integration processes, we failed in Europe, but also in other parts of the world. And that's why we are facing even greater problems with migration issues than we should be doing it. The question from Conservative is quite outside my mandate. Nevertheless, it is very much connected because it is part of, I would say, anti-Muslim rhetoric. This is something that Council of Europe is very eager to embrace and also to look at as a problematic issue, the same way it is problematic to have anti-Semitic views or any other challenges that we are facing, unfortunately, in our societies. I'm very much aware of the problems in China. I know that the UN is quite vocal on these problems, but also several other international organizations. And I'm sure, as the Council of Europe, that our view on this is that this is absolutely unacceptable, what is happening to Rohingya and the Uyghur society in different countries, not just in China, but also in Myanmar and in some other parts of the world. But as you know, I have a mandate for 47, and of course I have views on this, but I don't have mandate to interfere. Gray zones, since the beginning of my mandate, I try to engage in making sure that people, and there are millions of people living in so-called gray zones, that do not have protection of the convention, simply because we do not have access to certain areas. And of course, as I stated since the beginning, I'm trying to reach out and to make sure that we can work and also access those regions. It is not easy. It is extremely, I would say, complicated. It is very politicized. It is also very difficult for Commissioner for Human Rights to do the work and also at the same time avoid any kind of politicization of the institution and also human rights work that is so much needed. Just before pandemic, I was in Moldova and I managed to visit Transnistria, which was the first gray zone that I managed to visit since the beginning of the mandate. Of course, there are plans also to move to other gray zones, of course, respecting fully international law and order when it comes to this. And I'm in constant, I can assure you, talks with all engaged in this process and with all actors in order to be able to visit gray zones. Nevertheless, I'm in contact with civil society and also with people that are suffering tremendously in many of those zones. So it goes without saying, we do try to monitor as much as we can. Of course, it would be perfect if I would be able to travel to any of the gray zones as soon as possible, but you would be first to know. if this happens, and I truly hope that we will soon see some results there.
Thank you. I will now continue with the speakers list. I think we have 16 people asking for the floor at the moment. I would propose to group questions by 3 and remind you that you have 1 minute to ask a question. First speaker on the list is Mrs. Bayer from Austria. No sound. You need to unmute. Can you speak again?
Connect again, we give her the floor later.
Mrs. Bayer, can you try to disconnect and reconnect? We give you the floor later because we can't hear you. Next speaker on the list is Mrs. Yaza from Turkey. Madam Yasser, are you there? Your mic is muted. Madame Yasser?
D'accord, voilà, bon. Voilà. Bonjour. Est-ce que ça marche? D'accord. Voilà, merci, Monsieur le Président. Pendant la pandémie, les problèmes préexistants des migrants ont augmenté. L'un de ces problèmes est le refoulement des migrants. Le droit international humanitaire, en particulier l'article 4 de la protocole numéro 4 à la Convention européenne des droits de l'homme, interdit clairement les expulsions collectives d'étrangers. Cette pratique empêchait le droit d'asile et la protection contre le refoulement des demandeurs d'asile. Conformément au récent appel, rapport et réglementation internationale concernant la situation humanitaire des migrants refoulés. Que peut faire le Conseil de l'Europe pour mieux protéger et promouvoir les droits des réfugiés et quels sont vos projets futurs pour empêcher le refoulement illégal en Europe? Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Madame. We'll give another try for Madame Bayer from Austria. I hope we can hear you now. Madame Bayer, we have no sound from you. Can we try again later? I would now give the floor to Mrs. Castel from Spain.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. First of all, thank you for your report, Madam Commissioner. We have written with interest. However, we are a little disappointed to see that no reference was made to the 9 Catalan political prisoners, nor statements prompting an investigation towards the police violence. Can you tell us when is the visit in Spain scheduled for? Since the COVID-19, the pro-independence leaders remain 23 hours every day in a cell. The visits and work permits and so on have been seriously restricted. We encourage you to make a public statement condemning the repression against peaceful political dissenters, but also in favor for those holding the same political opinions. More than 2,500 civilians are facing judicial harassment. More than 2,500 civilians. A whole movement has been retaliated against. What will be done by the Commissioner in this regard? Thank you very much, Mrs. Commissioner.
Thank you. Is Mrs. Bayer back? Okay. No? Okay. Then I'll give the word to Madame Tris of France.
Voilà. Bonjour, merci Monsieur le Président. Bonjour Madame la Commissaire et merci pour votre rapport. Moi, je voulais vous parler de toute autre chose. Je voulais vous parler de l'intelligence artificielle et de son développement très rapide qui pose de sérieux défis pour le respect des droits de l'homme et des libertés fondamentales. Vous-même, Madame la Commissaire, avez émis une recommandation le 14 mai 2019 dans laquelle vous avez encouragé les États membres à notamment procéder à des évaluations, mettre en place des consultations publiques, établir des contacts avec le secteur privé et assurer un contrôle parlementaire et judiciaire efficace. Quel accueil les États membres ont-ils réservé à cette recommandation? Et est-ce que vous constatez d'ores et déjà?
Merci beaucoup. I give the word to the Commissioner for the reply on the first round of questions. Mrs. Mijatović. Could you please unmute?
Sorry. Yeah. So first I will try to answer a question from the distinguished representative of Turkey in relation to refoulement, so-called pushbacks. This is, I would say, a long-standing issue, which I raised on several occasions during my visits. In my 2018 report on Greece, I urged Greek authorities to put an end to pushbacks and to investigate, which is extremely important, any allegations of ill treatment perpetrated by members of Greek security forces in the context of such operations. Since further, we were in contact with also other member states. I also visited my own home country, Bosnia and Herzegovina, where I raised this issue of pushbacks from the side of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also from the side of Croatia. And when persons at the border, I would say, are returned without any identification or procedure, member states cannot establish whether they may be sending them back to human rights violations contrary to Article 3 of the Convention and the non-refoulement principle. Such practice, of course, cannot be ignored, and I urge member states on each and every occasion to do their utmost in order to investigate any accusations of this kind and to carry out effective investigation into these allegations. And we hear allegations all the time, and this is an issue that we will continue following and raising. And of course, Council of Europe can do a lot in this area, but at the end, it is really the responsibility of each and every member states to investigate and not to allow this kind of violations that unfortunately is happening. Madame Castel, on the Catalan issue, as you probably noted in my introduction, it was dedicated to COVID-19, and I didn't make any statements in relation to any particular country and any particular issue or a statement that I made also in the previous period. When it comes to police violence, you are probably aware that at the very beginning of demonstrations, I made a very clear statement in relation to this and also communicated this message to the Spanish authority. I also met with the president of the Catalan Parliament and many interlocutors in order to tackle these issues. I'm planning, of course, to visit Spain. We still do not know the date, but if the date is scheduled, of course, this will be something that you are informed as a parliamentarians as well, because it's my practice before the visits, if there is possibility, that I also meet members of the parliament. I can assure you that I will continue following, but when it comes to my statements, I make them when I deem necessary to do so, but it doesn't mean that I'm not engaging using all mechanisms that I have at my disposal in order to tackle any potential allegations on human rights violations. Madame Trisset, on artificial intelligence, thank you for raising it. I think because of pandemic, somehow this topic is a bit neglected, even though it has and it will have a great impact on human rights. Thank you for mentioning our publication. At a very early stage of my mandate, I gathered a group of experts and we also received a lot of information from member states that are moving fast, including France, when it comes to artificial intelligence. Of course, recommendations are there. It is still too early to say how those recommendations are implemented, or is this something that member states are taking into account. But that is why I have country visits, and hopefully this will start happening as soon as possible, where I can check and also see if there are any examples of impact artificial intelligence has on human rights. We already know that in many member states, when it comes to healthcare, social security, employment, everything that can be done by algorithms, we already know that there were serious violations. So these issues can be taken as examples, not to repeat the mistakes for many member states. But I think pandemic also is giving to all governments and all of us in international organizations even more responsibility to tackle the challenge of artificial intelligence. And my office is continuously trying to see how we can engage not only inside Council of Europe, but also with other international organizations to see how these issues can be tackled the best possible way. We also have CAHAI that is moving and meeting, and they have a very strong position because they're an intergovernmental body. So all this, I think, will create more transparency for the governments and more responsibility for the governments in order to make sure that human rights are not violating. But at the same time, making sure that artificial intelligence is something that we should embrace and see it as a benefit for the society, and not just create certain fears that will undermine new technologies and the developments in our societies.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. We come now to the next round of questions. The next speaker is Mrs. Aslan from Switzerland.
Besten Dank, Herr Präsident, geschätzte Damen und Herren. Auch ich möchte mich für diesen Bericht bedanken, und meine Frage geht dahin, dass im Moment sehr viele Familien, die nicht verheiratet sind, also Partner und Partnerinnen, nicht den anderen Partner, Partnerin besuchen können. Es gibt auch die Kampagne im Moment, dass in Europa läuft, das heißt Love is not tourism. Das wird auch breit unterstützt, und meine Frage geht dahin, ob Sie dieses Thema auch im Visier haben und hier Vorschläge haben. Besten Dank.
Vielen Dank. Next speaker is Mrs. Yasko from Ukraine. I understand we had a technical difficulty, Mrs. Aslan, as you spoke in German. you need to do so while being on the floor function so that the translators can follow your question. Could you kindly go on floor or original version, I think, is it in the German menu, and repeat your question? I'm sorry. And you have to ask for the floor so we can give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I tried.
Sorry, we can't hear you. Can you please try again? Can you please start again? Okay, we can't see or hear you at the moment. I get to the next speaker and may call you again later if that's feasible. Next speaker is Mrs. Yasko from Ukraine. Okay, Ms. Yasko kept disappearing and reappearing on the list. So the next speaker is Mr. Yildiz from Turkey, first male speaker in this session.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Being first is always good. Madam Rapporteur, I appreciate your focus on refugees and displaced, who are the most vulnerable, of course. When you criticize members of the Council for not sharing the burden of frontline states, Italy, Malta, and Greece, you didn't mention Turkey, which is the first frontline state indeed. This made me curious whether when you have visited Turkey, have you been to refugee centers, camps? What are your impressions, and are you aware of the burden on the shoulders of Turkey? Thank you very much.
Do we have either Mrs. Aslan or Mrs. Bayer ready to speak now? Or? Mrs. Aslan, one more try, please. Mrs. Aslan? Okay. Okay, next speaker on the list is Mr. Vadansan from Armenia.
Dear Mr. President, do you hear me? Okay, should I ask my question?
Okay.
There is a problem that partners who are not married can visit the other partner in another country. And there's a campaign in Europe which name is Love is Not Tourism. So is that also a topic on which you are looking for, and what is the solution to do something in that case? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now it worked. Is Mr. Vadansan from Armenia in the line? Vadanyan, I'm sorry. Vadanyan. Yes.
I'm joined, yes, I'm Vartanyan. First of all, I would like to express words of gratitude to Ms. Mijatović for an excellent report, as well as the interim report of quarterly report of this year. But I would like ask the following question. In the report, I didn't find anything concerning the influence of armed conflicts on dissemination to the COVID-19 in Europe. I would like just to mention that we had very good results. We had less than 10% of increase of person infected by COVID-19. But after Azerbaijani aggression and attacks towards the Armenian territory, a lot of people here in Armenia and in Artsakh were obliged to be refugees in the shelters, to find a refuge in the shelters. And this led to the real increase of numbers of the person infected. So we had before about 10%, now we have about 30%. Actually, this is the really huge complex issue for the protection of human rights, since the people is obliged to find the shelter somewhere. And unfortunately, I didn't find any information about this influence or impact to the human rights protection. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I will now give the Commissioner the opportunity to answer the 3 questions that we finally got collected. Mrs. Mijatović.
Thank you. I understood immediately the question from Mrs. Aslan. So briefly, when it comes to same-sex marriage, this is an issue that is very high on my agenda. This is an issue that I'm also discussing with member states, welcoming new legislation, and also using my right to submit third-party interventions in relation to certain cases when it comes to same-sex marriages. When it comes to this problem of crossing borders and joining the partner, I must say that I didn't tackle it in the previous period. It doesn't mean that this is not important, but of course there were many other issues that I was trying to tackle it. So the short answer is yes, same-sex marriages is very high on my agenda, but when it comes to this particular problem, this is not an issue that I covered during this period of confinement and since the beginning of pandemic. Question from Mr. Yildiz from Turkey. No, I didn't mention Turkey, but there is no any particular reason, because when it comes to migration and Turkey's role, I mentioned it and I'm sure you are aware of it on many occasions during my visits to Turkey, but also during many public appearances I had and when I spoke about migration, sharing burden, solidarity with states. So I think, this is something that is quite known and public. During my visit, I met with many officials and also with international organizations working in Turkey, including UNHCR, in order to see the issues that Turkey is going through when it comes to migration and enormous number of people that are finding their home in Turkey. So this is something that is understandable, but yes, I did not mention it in this particular moment, which does not mean in any way that I'm not aware about the situation and the burden that Turkey has to go through when it comes to migration. The last question, I'm not sure I understood it correctly, but the impact of COVID when it comes to any kind of conflict or any situation, including situation in migration camps, in prisons, anywhere where there is a huge number of people and problems that the states are facing when it comes to access to health and also spread of COVID is something that I'm following. When it comes to Armenia, Azerbaijan, happenings in the last few months and everything that I followed, this was not an issue that I looked at. Of course, I look at the issue of protection of the civilians, hate speech, and many other issues that are related to this conflict. When it comes to COVID pandemic and the spread, of course, this is an issue that I'm aware of, but it is not something that I tackled in my previous report, which does not mean it can be, because today we are in a way discussing a previous period, but not in relation to impact of COVID on population in Nagorno-Karabakh.
Thank you. I will now call again Mrs. Bayer from Austria.
Do you hear me now?
Yeah.
Hooray. Thank you very much. Mrs. Commissioner, you mentioned that while the pandemic, sexual and reproductive rights were under pressure and access to services were very limited, we are at the beginning or in the middle of a second wave. What do you think to be best prepared to avoid a lockdown of human rights, especially when it comes to violence against women? And I want to echo my colleague Petra Stinen, which is very often caused by unbalanced distribution of power. So do you also think that there were good practices we learned during the first wave of the pandemic, which we also could transfer for a time afterwards? And the second issue I want to tackle is, you mentioned elderly, migrants. I also want to add minorities, marginalized and vulnerable people and groups and their needs, which are very often neglected. What Council of Europe instruments do you think we shall foster to guarantee their fundamental rights? Which activities would be most urgent to adapt or improve our legal instruments to protect them? Thank you.
Thank you. And we try again with Mrs. Yasko of Ukraine.
Hello. Well, finally, first of all, I want to thank Mrs. Mijatović for her work and her leadership in protecting one of the most important pillars of the Council of Europe, is human rights. And the second thing, I've read in the media that Russian authorities are very critical of the work of Dunja Mijatović because she said that she doesn't see evidence for any restrictions of the Russian language speakers in Ukraine. Therefore, I have a question. What is your opinion on the situation of the access to education in one native language in occupied territories in Europe? Of course, I'm asking about Crimea, because currently Ukrainian language schools and Crimean Tatar schools unfortunately cannot function properly because Russian authorities don't allow them to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. The last speaker in this round is Mr. Sadov. I already announced that I will probably group 5 speakers for the final 2 rounds so that we can complete in time. We've been going on for more than an hour now, and invite Mrs. Mijatović to answer this round of questions, and then hopefully we can be brief on the remaining 2 sessions where we will group 5 questions instead of 3. Mr. Sadov.
Thank you, Mr. President and Mr. Commissioner. You said about the protection of the civilians and the human rights of these people. I think you are very well aware about another one crime against humanity, which had happened the day before yesterday. The ballistic missile from Armenia directly targeted one of the biggest city in Azerbaijan, Ganja city, and the very big part of Ganja had been destroyed. More than 10 people have been killed, and more than 30 have been wounded, which is the real and the vivid example of the a crime against humanity. And as a commissioner, what do you think about these kind of barbarian acts which unfortunately Armenia prepared against Azerbaijan? Thank you.
Thank you. And now Mrs. Mijatović for the response.
Thank you, Chairman. First question from Ms. Baer. I think I already answered quite a lot in relation to the violence against women also during pandemic. What I think is crucial again is the ratification and the full implementation of Istanbul Convention, making it really something happening in the society and not just words on paper and commitment on paper, but actually in practice. I think Council of Europe has enormous resources and mechanisms in order to tackle the issue of violence. There are many lessons learned during pandemic and also exposure of the problems in the society. But at the same time, and it's quite unfortunate, I must say, that I did not or I was not made aware of any brilliant examples that can be used for the future. So I think we have a long way to go when it comes to this social phenomena that we need to tackle with the open eyes and also being very realistic that this is not going to be an easy task. How to make sure that we behave better during this so-called second wave of process of normalizations. It's called different in different countries and also regions. But at the same time, I think it's extremely important to recognize that we need to do more. And the states and the governments that are in place at the moment have a huge responsibility to tackle this issue and to engage with the organizations that can help, including Council of Europe. And that's why in my call, in my introduction, in my call to all of you, I shifted my focus and I called parliaments to do more, to make governments accountable in order to tackle these issues. Because I think the burden is also on each and every of you and also to all parliaments tackling the issue of the violence against women. And that's why I think now we will be more equipped and ready to tackle these issues than at the beginning of the pandemic, hopefully. Mr. Sado, in relation to, no, sorry, it was Mrs. Jasko, Ukraine. When it comes to languages, I would say that many member states of the Council of Europe have laws on the use of languages. While I would say the aim is often to reinforce the knowledge and also the use of one official or state language, which is perfectly, I would say, legitimate, sometimes this is done without sufficient consultation with the speakers of the minority and concerns for their needs and to determine of the rights of the national minorities, which I think is extremely important. So on one side, yes, we should recognize this, but it is not something that can be done overnight in a hasty way without consulting the minority. For this reason, in October 2019, I published Human Rights Comment, which I think I also made you aware of this when we met in Strasbourg, on language laws and policies. And in my comment, I stressed the need for language laws and policies in all Council of Europe member states to be carefully balanced with a view to accommodating diversity of the society, protecting minority rights, and diffusing tensions in society. So not to be used as a weapon in order to steer certain differences and political gains when it comes to this. While I would say there is no one-size-fits-all solution, I did refer to laws and policies adopted in several specific member states, and I recommended that these should not be pursued at the expense of the rights of speakers of other languages, especially those belonging to national minorities. But as a matter of general principle, I have called for the depoliticization of languages issues if possible. And I want to again refer to invaluable work of the Advisory Committee on the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities and the Venice Commission, of course, in respect of the member states concerned. So as I already stated, we have many mechanisms, monitoring bodies, and possibilities at the Council of Europe to tackle the issues, offering assistance. But this is not something that just us can be engaged in. When I say us, I mean people working for the Council of Europe. This is something that needs full engagement, trust, and genuine political will of the states in question in order to tackle this very, I would say, sensitive and important issues for the well-being of the society. Excluding any parts of the society and making sure that they cannot communicate and learn in their own language is a huge problem for any democracy. And of course, I will continue working on this in the future, also cooperating with other Council of Europe mechanisms in order to tackle this.
Thank you. Next speaker on my list was Mrs. Ratian from Armenia, but she has disappeared, I understand, from the list. Then I give the word to Mr. Hammarberg from Sweden.
I was very impressed by the report from the Commissioner. I think it was a very full description of the problems that has arisen, and also making clear that there are two aspects to this problem, really. One is that governments have not managed to protect, especially the vulnerable people, from the problems that have been coming with the pandemic. Otherwise, in other cases, governments have used the fear people have about the pandemic to introduce more restrictive ways of governing the country. And that's also something that could lead to human rights problems. I would like to emphasize two aspects here. One is the need to secure that people who are in institutions and forced to be in institutions, that they are protected from being neglected and thereby more vulnerable. I think about prisoners in several countries. We know that the problems in prisons could also affect the health of prisoners, and that's not the idea with imprisonment. And therefore, it's necessary to try to find ways of securing that prisoners
Can I remind you of the time?
Given. Pardon? 1
minute.
Okay, thank you very much. So what more could be done when it comes to protecting the rights of those who are put in prison? And in fact, the same problem is there for disabled people who are unfortunate still in some countries in institutions without full freedom of movement. CPT has made some important advice on this, but I think more needs to be done.
Thank you. Next speaker on the list is Mr. Melkumian from Armenia. Still there?
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président. Bonjour, Madame Commissaire, la Commissaire. Très bien présentation, votre rapport. Et je pense que c'est très effectif pour nous et pour tous. Mais j'ai une question différente. Comment vous pensez, Madame Mijatović, comment il est possible de garder le droit de l'homme pendant la guerre concrètement pendant la guerre dans la zone de sécurité et dans la République de l'Artsakh. Est-ce qu'il est possible de garder? Et est-ce que vous avez la solution correspondante pour cela? Pourquoi je dis cette question? Parce que vous devez voir concrètement dans la zone de l'Artsakh, parce que en résultat de bombardements dans l'agression, la Turquie et l'Azerbaïdjan, nous avons beaucoup de victimes, beaucoup, dizaines de victimes, la population civile. Et j'invite vous concrètement demain, après-demain, dans la République Arménie et dans la République Artsakh pour voir concrètement qu'est-ce que nous avons et qu'est-ce que vous présentez pour solution à ce problème. Concrètement, rapport, c'est très bien, c'est très efficace, rapport, l'estimation, etc. Comment il est possible d'arrêter ce problème, c'est-à-dire la guerre? S'il vous plaît, répondre. Comment il est possible? Merci pour votre attention.
Thank you. Next speaker on the list is Mr. Tolstoy from Russia.
Добрый день, вы меня слышите? Окей. Добрый день, уважаемый господин председатель, добрый день, уважаемые коллеги. Я хотел бы привлечь внимание к проблеме двойных стандартов. Как мы знаем, права человека универсальны и не терпят никаких искажений. В связи с этим у меня есть вопрос по поводу нарушения прав человека, на которые очень быстро реагируют уполномоченные, и системных нарушений, которых зачастую предпочитают не замечать или реагировать с большим опозданием. Я сейчас имею в виду систематическое преследование русскоязычного населения в странах Балтии и попрание прав на преподавание, обучение и использование родного языка для 20 миллионов жителей Украины. Это большая проблема для Европы, это большая проблема для русских. И я считаю, что Совет Европы не может делать вид, что этой проблемы не существует. В связи с этим у меня вопрос. Какие конкретные действия будут предприняты для того, чтобы изменить эту ситуацию, которая деградировала с момента государственного переворота на Украине в 2014 году? Хочу также добавить, что в Крыму, о чем говорила наша украинская коллега, преподавание ведется на украинском, крымско-татарском и русском языке. Все три языка являются государственными. На Украине систематически преследуется русский язык, который сейчас выводится из образовательной системы. Какие будут предприняты меры со стороны Совета Европы, чтобы остановить грубейшее нарушение прав русского человека на Украине? Спасибо.
Thank you. Next speaker on the list is Mr. Molasada from Azerbaijan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Mijatović, just recently, military advisor of Armenian Prime Minister Bagirjakovanian said on Russian TV that they're shelling Azerbaijani cities out of zone conflict with the goal to create panic and chaos. As a result of this missile shelling, we have a lot of victim children, women, civil people. Is it possible for you to raise an issue creating a specific tribunal on military crimes which happen, and victims of these crimes are children and women. Is it possible this rude violation of human rights punish with a goal to prevent this type of crimes to future in European system? We had Srebrenica tribunal, we had a Rwanda tribunal, which is very, very important. We could not create tribunal on Khojaly when city was massacred, but this type of prevention should be a goal of all European juridical system. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the word to the Commissioner for answers, and then we have one more round of questions that we try to complete.
Thank you, Chairman. I do apologize to Mr. Saidov from the previous group of parliamentarians who asked questions. I didn't reply to his question, which in a way can also be connected to several other questions and in relation to Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. I think you should also take into account that I'm Commissioner for Human Rights. I am not representing a security body or dealing with the political issues when it comes to creating a tribunal that is under UN anyway. You mentioned Srebrenica, Rwanda. We are all aware of these possibilities. And of course, I would welcome any possibility where impunity for war crimes is something that is absolutely unacceptable. Nevertheless, I have to say that I'm deeply concerned about the devastating and indiscriminate impact of shelling on the civilian population. I deplore the growing number of civilian casualties on both sides. I urge the parties to the conflict to abide by the international humanitarian and human rights obligations that they are aware of, protect civilian population from the effect of armed conflict, and preserve civilian infrastructure and services essential for the population, such as schools, medical facilities, or water supplies. I can also mention, something that is quite important. I think I come from the country that does not exist any longer, former Yugoslavia, that was in a way dissolved because of terrifying, horrible war and death of hundreds of thousands of people. But then again, after a certain period of time, we have to look back and look at war crimes and human rights. And this is something that I think we should not forget, how important it is to make sure that all parts of the conflict are really made aware to focus on all human rights aspect of this conflict, including also the situation of those who have lost their home, and there are many, or had to leave their place of residence for safety. During my last visit to Azerbaijan last year, I met with many IDPs in different parts, and I spoke to people, and I really I was made aware of their suffering. So this is something that we as the Council of Europe should not neglect, not forget. But when it comes to, for example, use of cluster bombs that violates international human rights law, which prohibits indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks, it is of utmost importance that civilians be spared and protected from any such form of attacks. I will continue following. I'm also following any political efforts in order to find solutions and engage in a meaningful dialogue that will stop suffering of many people. And of course, I will continue looking at human rights issues in time of war and in time of conflict, and it goes without saying that we will do so. It was more a statement and then at the end a question from Mr. Tolstoy in relation to the languages. I think I was clear on this. And then I will repeat again. I'm very much aware of the situation in many Council of Europe member states. I also mentioned that there are other mechanisms that we have at the disposal from the Advisory Committee on the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities and, of course, Venice Commission. During my visits, I do raise these issues. During my analysis of the situations, I also raised the issues of the languages. As a matter of the general principle, I have called for depoliticization of the languages issues, and I want to again stress how important it is that this issue is not used as a political weapon by any side in order to steer political debates, incite hatred among people. And unfortunately, in many of those situations, without using this opportunity now to name and shame, I've seen this as a tool to really not at the end think about people that cannot communicate and learn in their languages, but again, to make a political point and to steer a debate that will not bring any good to the minority or majority that is really engaging in this. Of course, I mentioned human rights comment. I raised the issue. You mentioned particularly Ukraine. I also raised the issue when it comes to education law in Latvia, that they were slowly reducing the share of teaching in Russian in secondary schools, moving away from the established bilingual system. I was critical on situation in some other countries. But then again, when it comes to making a decision when I will react in relation to which country, I would dare to say, this is really something that I will decide. I will not be influenced by any statements or any calls by any government in order to make sure that certain issues are tackled. I do it because it's in my mandate, and I do it when I think it is necessary. And I will, of course, continue looking at these issues and following the situations, and I do hope I will soon visit some of the countries in questions and raise these issues prominently and directly. Mr. Hammenberg mentioned the issue that was very high on my agenda and very present during confinement. One of the first statements I made with the clear recommendations to the states, it was related to situation in prisons. Many states made some very positive moves in relation to relax the situations and to make sure that COVID does not spread in prisons. But of course, this is not enough. Now is the time to do as much as we can before second wave, if there is a second wave, or because we do not know in which direction are we moving. Of course, we are all hoping for better, but this is definitely the population that needs to be protected for different reasons. And then, of course, disabled people. This is also one of the statements I made during confinement, where we really tried to offer certain recommendations to member states in order to do more. I said at the beginning that really situation with the minorities, and this is something that Mrs. Bayer mentioned, it's not just women's rights or rights of certain groups, but it's also rights of minorities, Roma, LGBTI, all people that suffered before pandemic suffered even more when it comes to human rights during pandemic. And this is one of the lessons that we should not forget, and we should make sure that this is something that is not neglected or not forgotten the moment we move forward to so-called normality.
Thank you. I will now call for the final round of questions, and may again kindly ask every speaker to be as brief as possible and within the 1 minute time limit. Next speaker on the list is Mrs. Fatalieva from Azerbaijan.
Mr. Chairman, Madam President, Madam Commissioner, protection of the rights of children is priority in the human rights protection, and there is no doubt in that. And starting from September this year, as a result of the Armenian armed force shelling of Azerbaijani settlements, 37 schools have been destroyed. 3 school children were killed as a result of the shooting of civilians. A day before, in missile attack of Ganja city, children were wounded, some of them lost their parents. Madam Commissioner, I'm sure that you will agree with me that any crime must be punished, and the inaction and absence of any reaction is regarded as a direct encouragement of terrorism. And my question is, what is your position as a Commissioner of Human Rights on violation of the rights of Azerbaijani children who are suffering from this armed conflict? Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Yavarov from Azerbaijan.
Hello. I would like to regarding the current situation in Armenia. As you might know, the investigation has been for
Mr. Jafarov?
Yes?
Please move the language selector on your screen to floor. The language selector to floor, please.
Okay, I did. Sorry. So my question is regarding the current situation in Armenia. As you might be aware that right now a criminal investigation has been launched for 2 previous ex-president, and also just 2 weeks ago the leader of main opposition party, the leader of second biggest fraction in Armenian parliament, was stripped of his immunity and jailed. And actually he said that he is jailed because of he's criticizing the Pashinyan's government for not handling COVID-19 pandemic. So I would like to know whether are you aware of this fact and what is your position on that? Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Yalov from Sweden.
I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much, Commissioner. Thank you very much for interesting development.
Mr. Jallo, excuse me. Again, the same request. If you could please move your language selector on the bottom of your screen, left side to floor, please.
There you go. Thank you. Sorry for that. I hope you can hear me now. Thank you so much, Madam Commissioner, for the amazing work that you do and for your report and for the leadership that you have been showing in the very important work that you do. My question is basically on the issue concerning racism and the violation of human rights, structural racism that we've been discussing in the light of what happened in the US with George Floyd, that somehow has been discussed throughout Europe too. One thing, the EU, there has been several developments within the EU. For example, we have now EU Commissioner for Equality, we have a EU Anti-Racism Coordinator, we have an EU Action Plan on Anti-Racism. There is an EU Commissioner's high-level meeting that they never had on racism. They have an EU Anti-Racism Summit that is coming up next spring. They have a potential new legislation, including the widening of existing hate speech and hate crime legislation. And then you have EU member state anti-racism action plans that they want to be in place before end of 2020. So my question is, what is the Commissioner doing from the perspective of the Council of Europe to tackle the structural racism in our member states? What exactly are we doing to make sure that we also, just like the EU, would make sure we have the tools that we need to be able to fight against structural racism? Thank you.
Thank you. I have 2 more speakers on the list who have reconnected. Apparently, first is Mrs. Hayretian from Armenia.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to say thank you, Madam Mijatović, for your very detailed report. And as you probably very well know, that there is now an ongoing war between Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan, because Azerbaijan on early morning of September 27th has launched a large-scale military aggression against peaceful population of Nagorno-Karabakh. And of course, war has its consequences, and civilians are suffering the war. Since you tackle the topic of gray zones, I wonder if you would consider in future to visit Nagorno-Karabakh, because people there, which are all the time being bombarded by Azerbaijan, civilians there living in Stepanakert, Shushi, Hadrut, Martuni, and different other cities and villages, are now standing in front of a real humanitarian catastrophe. And I would like to ask you to pay attention on this issue and consider your possible visit to the conflict zone, because I think that human rights are beyond any kind of political issues and topics. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. And final speaker on the question list would be Mrs. Sozavetizan, also from Armenia.
Hi there. I kind of want to also draw your attention to this humanitarian catastrophe that has happened since the Azerbaijani aggression supported by Turkey with the terrorists. And the question is on the terrorists, because there are reputable sources that claim that mercenaries from Syria were transferred with the support of Turkey to operate against the people of Nagorno-Karabakh Republic. And I also want to kind of stress the importance of Human Rights Commissioner to be there and see with her eyes the cassette bombs that were shot on Stepanakert, the targeting of civilians, killing of theirs. I understand it's a difficult topic. I understand all the emotions here, but I think the truth should be seen from the actuality, from the point where all of this is happening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I apologize, Mr. Sovatin. I had a wrong indication on my list in terms of your name. I'm sorry. So this concludes the list of speakers, and I give the floor to Mrs. Mijatović for the concluding roundup of answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all parliamentarians that took part in discussion and also asked many questions that are extremely important for my work. Many parliamentarians from Armenia and Azerbaijan asked about my work and my involvement when it comes to human rights. I think I was very clear in my statement from last week, but also now when I was trying to answer questions from many distinguished parliamentarians. What I think is important here is to recognize people's suffering. And again, not talk only about my children, our children, but of all children that are suffering. And of course, as a commissioner, I'm not looking only at the suffering of children of one nation. I'm looking at the suffering of children of all nations that are affected by this terrible war and conflict that will create many situations where members of the family are no longer together because they are displaced, not to mention because they are killed. And of course, those are grave human rights violations. I will remain really on top of this issue. When it comes to visits, of course, there is always a possibility for the Commissioner to go to member states and to look at human rights violations. I have huge hopes that wisdom and common sense will prevail in order to stop suffering of people. Of course, with the full understanding of the international law, international order, and a need to respect human rights in this very difficult situation. One question was related to the presence of mercenaries from Syria. I would just here recall that the European Court of Human Rights decided on 6th of October to apply Rule 39 of the Rules of Court interim measure, so-called interim measure, as you are aware of, calling on all states directly or indirectly involved in the conflict, including Turkey, to refrain from actions that contribute to breaches of the Convention, rights of civilians, and to respect their obligation under the Convention, which I think is of extreme importance, and it's important for my work. On this, I can also say that the usage of different weapons, and I already mentioned cluster bombs, is something that is extremely worrying. And this is also an issue that I do follow, and I will in the future try to engage even more. I'm also aware of other international organizations and the latest statement from High Commissioner Bachelet on Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, where also hate speech was mentioned as a tool to create problems in the society, also in times of conflict. All this is extremely sensitive, as one of the parliamentarians said, and also very difficult and quite emotional issue. But what is important here is to make sure that we stop people suffering. And this is something that I will leave as an end of my statement on this, with assuring you and assuring both countries that I will continue working with both governments in trying to make sure that assistance from my office will contribute to the peaceful solutions and end of suffering, to put an end of suffering of people. To Mr. Yalov on structural racism, of course, this is something that is extremely important. It is part of the mandate of the Commissioner. You will soon see some of our products, if I may say so, and we are working closely. You mentioned FRA, and also their landmark, I would say, report when it comes to treatment of Black people in Europe. And this is something that we will closely follow, and also soon have some work presented also to public, and at the same time presented to all of you parliamentarians. I apologize in case I did not answer all questions in detail. It was very long session, but very much appreciated and needed, particularly in this time of pandemic, when we do not have possibility to see each other in person. But I think we are slowly moving back to Strasbourg, and I hope that our next session will be even longer if needed, in order to really make sure that we have active communication, and also that my work is transparent, and that I'm also accountable to any kind of criticism or questions that I welcome very much. It makes me even more energetic and responsible in performing my role as your Commissioner for Human Rights. So I thank you very much.
Well, this concludes our exchange with the Commissioner for Human Rights. Dear Commissioner, Mrs. Mijatović, I thank you most sincerely for your informative statement and for this fruitful and very extended Q&A session and exchange of views with the members of the Assembly. Thank you very much for the time and the effort that you put into this, and we will keep our dialogue ongoing in the future. Many thanks to you.
Thank you.
We now come to the joint debate on two reports. The first, from the Committee on Equality and Non-Discrimination, is titled Upholding Human Rights in Times of Crisis and Pandemics, Gender Equality and Non-Discrimination, document 15129, to be presented by Mrs. Petra Stienen from ALDE Group Netherlands. The second report, from the Committee on Migration, Refugees and Displaced Persons, is titled Humanitarian Consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic for migrants and refugees, document 15142, to be presented by Mr. Pierre-Alain Frides, Switzerland, for the Socialist Group. Before we have a handover in the chair, and I thank you for your great cooperation, I call Mrs. Steenen to present the first report. Mrs. Steenen, you have 10 minutes in total, which you may divide between presentation of the report and reply to the debate. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, what a day, what a day. I'm still very impressed by this 1.5 hours we had with the Commissioner for Human Rights. And somehow I feel that she could, many of her words, you can find them in my report. So tonight, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, Mark Rutte, will announce new measures in an attempt to stop the growing numbers of COVID-19 infections in the Netherlands. And I can tell you the country is concerned. Will we have to go back in lockdown? What about our freedom to move, to see family, to be with friends? Mark Rutte, like all leaders in the Council of Europe member states, is faced with a very difficult balancing act. On the one hand, how can we protect public health of all our citizens, while in the meantime, how can we uphold their human rights? This morning we heard how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted our democracies, rule of law and human rights. My report focuses on the impact the COVID-19 crisis and the following measures had on different groups and different genders. And I will call on us all present here in this call, but also people who can read the report, to learn from this pandemic, not just for the next stages of this pandemic or future crisis, but also for how we can deal with diversity in our societies in a very inclusive, I would almost say intersectional way, as this will increase the resilience of our citizens in case we have to deal with this pandemic longer than we expected. And I think we need to ask ourselves, where are our blind spots in the way we are dealing with this pandemic? Who is at the table when decisions and emergency measures are being discussed? What data do we have at our disposal? Whom and what do we miss? And how can we prevent it from happening again? In my report, we can find 3 lessons in the draft resolution and the explanatory memorandum, which might provide answers to these questions. But first, at this point, I would really like to thank the amazing Secretariat and the members of the Equality and Non-Discrimination Committee for their work and excellent insights. So the 3 lessons are, number 1, this crisis has put a spotlight on structural inequalities in our societies. A case in point is the increase of gender-based and domestic violence. The Commissioner of Human Rights has alluded to this as well. The second lesson is that a blame game that targets, for example, minority groups or migrants by hatred, by racism, will get us nowhere. And the third lesson, only an inclusive, intersectional approach at every level of our government, parliaments and healthcare institutions will ensure the long-term protection of human rights of our citizens. Yesterday, I spoke to a good friend about my report. She's a family doctor in a mixed neighborhood in The Hague. And this is the city I'm speaking from to you now. And this conversation reminded me of the saying, we're all facing the same storm, but not all with the same shelter. My friend, the family doctor, was really worried. And I think many of her worries confirm the findings of my report. Her patients don't live in the neighborhoods most of us live in. Of course, I'm assuming, but I guess that many of us live in spacious apartments or houses that allow for social distancing. I think probably all of us, most of us, have good functioning Wi-Fi and computers that allow for homeschooling, and with parks nearby that allow for the necessary exercise. And I guess many of us don't have to worry to be infected in public transport because many of us can either walk or afford a car to take us anywhere. So, dear colleagues, the first big lesson of the COVID-19 crisis is clear. This pandemic has put a spotlight on structural inequalities in our societies. And in addition, in many cases, government measures in response to this crisis have aggravated these inequalities as well. Millions of citizens in our member states live in difficult circumstances. And they felt the first wave of the pandemic in a completely different way than many of the politicians, parliamentarians, and decision makers did. They didn't find information that was accessible to them. People with disabilities, speakers of minority languages, were not immediately integrated in communication strategies from the start. We've talked about this already. Women and often children were often in lockdown situation with their abuser while shelters were being closed. But we also have to look at the special position of men, especially men of a certain age, suffering from obesity. Elderly people and persons with certain comorbidity factors have higher risk contracting and suffering severely from COVID-19. Many of these citizens work as frontline workers in supermarkets, hospitals, factories. They are often low-paid workers and they are often working in precarious circumstances and therefore being exposed to a greater risk to the illness. I also am concerned about the communication at many governments that are actually reinforcing stereotyping of what a family consists of. Very much family, papa, mama, 2 kids. But what about the single parent families? What about single people who are often not considered in government measures? And what about same-sex couples or people within the LGBTQI community who were faced with a lot of harassment? It is clear that any one-size-fits-all approach will have excluded many of these citizens in our societies. The second lesson is that there was a lot of solidarity, for sure, in our communities during the crisis, but we also saw an increase in hatred and racism. Mr. Jallo alluded to this in the previous session with the Commissioner. We have seen stigmatization and incitement, hatred. Many groups were depicted as vectors of contagion, even as a cause of the pandemic. So this increased manifestation of hatred, racism is very concerning. I'm actually not surprised that the Black Lives Matter movement gained traction parallel to the COVID-19 crisis. Now, this blame game, be it at governmental level by parliamentarians or in the media, will get us nowhere, but will only increase the inequalities and discrimination in our societies. And then the third lesson is therefore that we need an inclusive response to this crisis with a long-term view. The measures taken were intended to tackle the immediate crisis, but will have long-term consequences as well. I think the Council of Europe has an important lesson for all of us. Our own history has an important lesson. We dealt with the biggest crisis of the 20th century. This is the origin of the Council of Europe. And many treaties of our organization can be instrumental in being more inclusive in dealing with pandemics such as COVID-19. Well, we are aware of that crisis reveal inequalities in our society. This awareness doesn't immediately lead to change. And therefore, I call on all of you to take action, to be inclusive. When we initially were asked to write this report as a committee, the focus was on violence against women. But we pleaded to have a broader scope of this report, because as much as it is understandable that this crisis has increased gender inequalities, we also saw that young people suffered a lot. Children who are not able to get homeschooling, teenagers, and we all have people around us, young people around us, who are really suffering from lack of proper education at the moment. So I call on you, let's make an inclusive long-term view within the framework of all the amazing treaties, conventions we have in our organization. And I'm curious to hear your reactions and questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Stinem. And I now call Mr. Friede to present the second report. You have 10 minutes in total, which you may divide between presentation of the report or reply to the debate. You have the floor.
Chers collègues, bonjour. La commission des migrations est l'une des 5 commissions qui a été chargée de préparer un rapport sur ce sujet qui habite notre quotidien depuis des mois, parce qu'il est apparu primordial au sein du Conseil de l'Europe que le problème des réfugiés soit également pris en compte face à cette pandémie. Le Covid-19 a eu des conséquences pour tout le monde. Elle ne fait preuve d'aucune discrimination. Elle peut nous toucher toutes et tous, parlementaires, chefs d'État, mais également personnes en situation de migration. Nul n'est protégé. Alors que dire pour les plus vulnérables, tels que les migrants, les réfugiés, les demandeurs d'asile, les femmes en situation de migration et les enfants migrants non accompagnés? Ils ont subi des conséquences souvent encore beaucoup plus pénibles que la population générale. En effet, nous avons assisté à une fermeture des frontières avec pour conséquence des migrants bloqués dans leur périple. Nous avons assisté à un arrêt des mesures de traitement des procédures de demande d'asile. Nous avons eu vent de migrants qui ont été entassés dans des camps où il a été difficile, voire impossible, d'appliquer les mesures de distanciation sociale. Nous avons été informés de l'ouverture de nouvelles routes de passage pour les migrants, des routes particulièrement dangereuses le plus souvent. Ces femmes et ces hommes en situation de migration ont, qui plus est, subi des réactions d'hostilité et ont été victimes de stigmatisation et empêchés, encore plus qu'à l'accoutumée, de tout mouvement, de peur qu'il soit vecteur de contagion. Nous avons vécu pendant tous ces mois des situations de déstabilisation très profondes dans nos différents États. Les États ont souvent fait tout ce qu'ils pouvaient et souvent ils ont été débordés par l'ampleur des difficultés et des défis à surmonter. Face aux dizaines de milliers de morts causées par ce virus, les craintes et les phénomènes de repli sur soi ont souvent pris le dessus. Mais ce qui est certain, c'est que dans le même temps, les causes à l'origine des migrations et de l'asile n'ont pas changé. Les guerres, les souffrances, la faim, les régimes dictatoriaux qui oppriment leur population n'ont pas disparu. Et un phénomène supplémentaire a déstabilisé nombre de pays en voie de développement. La diminution de l'argent qui a pu arriver dans ces pays provenant des diasporas, les remittances, un apport financier souvent primordial pour relever le PIB de ces États et stabiliser la vie de population dans des régions où l'existence est particulièrement difficile. Je vais m'attarder sur ces différents aspects des conséquences de la pandémie. Nous avons assisté à la réouverture d'anciens itinéraires, souvent dangereux, risqués, parce que, poussés par ce besoin de migration et de recherche d'asile, l'espoir de changer de vie, des gens sont prêts à tout pour trouver une solution à leurs problèmes. On a donc assisté, par exemple, à la réouverture de la route de migration par les îles Canaries, qui représente un long et périlleux voyage dans l'océan Atlantique. La réouverture de la route des Balkans s'est naturellement imposée, et bien entendu, des gens ont continué de tenter la traversée de la Méditerranée dans des embarcations de fortune, avec durant cette période une situation encore plus chaotique et risquée, liée au fait que tous les navires de secours ont été contraints de déserter les eaux de la Méditerranée durant une longue période. On a également pu constater une explosion des tentatives de traversée de la Manche. Le nombre de passages de migrants utilisant des petits bateaux dans la Manche a presque quintuplé cette année par rapport à 2019. On a malheureusement assisté dans différents pays européens à des phénomènes de tension et à des violences contre les migrants, avec des épisodes de refoulement, les pushbacks. Ces phénomènes ont été rapportés entre autres en Grèce, à la frontière entre la Croatie et la Bosnie-Herzégovine, et des problèmes liés au débarquement de migrants ont été signalés sur l'île de Malte. De nombreux États, et ce n'est pas de leur fait face à cette situation si particulière, ont été véritablement débordés. Et les migrants, les réfugiés, les demandeurs d'asile n'y étaient clairement plus une priorité. Ces misérables ont été livrés à eux-mêmes, avec pour seul objectif survivre. Dans des camps surpeuplés, la situation était compliquée et toutes les personnes fragilisées ont été, peut-être encore plus que par le passé, en proie à toutes les privations, des conditions d'existence terribles et toutes sortes de trafics. L'exiguïté des lieux et la mise en quarantaine de certains camps n'ont rien arrangé concernant la diffusion du virus. J'aimerais souligner ici que même s'il serait facile de stigmatiser certains pays pour le manque de moyens mis à disposition des migrants dans ces temps difficiles, il ne faut pas oublier que certains pays assument une particulièrement lourde charge dans ces questions de migration et d'asile. Ces pays sont ceux qui sont situés en première ligne et cela pose à nouveau cruellement le problème des relocalisations et du partage équitable des efforts. Je pense notamment au cas de la Grèce ou de la Turquie. On pourrait encore citer l'Italie, l'Espagne ou Malte. Maintenant que le virus a pris pied dans les camps de réfugiés, ces pays ont besoin impérativement que leur soit témoigné encore davantage de solidarité. Il est en effet essentiel que l'ensemble des pays membres de notre communauté internationale acceptent enfin de prendre leurs responsabilités et de ne pas faire peser toute la charge sur certains pays que la géographie a placés en première ligne sur la route des migrations. Un autre point très important concerne les risques augmentés auxquels ont été confrontés les enfants migrants, surtout non accompagnés. Selon les statistiques dévoilées par l'EKK Grèce et reprises par le HCR, en juillet, sur près de 4600 enfants non accompagnés en Grèce, seulement 1 sur 4 avait une place dans un refuge approprié. Début octobre, nous avons appris le projet d'ouverture de 3 nouveaux abris pour les enfants non accompagnés à Athènes. Et depuis les tragiques incendies de Moria sur l'île de Lesbos, 724 enfants non accompagnés ont été transférés des îles vers le continent en vue de leur relocalisation vers d'autres États européens. Des initiatives essentielles à saluer. Un autre point que j'aimerais aborder est celui des pays d'origine, des pays en développement d'où viennent la plupart des migrants. Au début, on a insisté sur le fait que ces pays étaient moins touchés pour plusieurs raisons. Tout d'abord, leur population est particulièrement jeune et l'âge est considéré comme un facteur essentiel dans la susceptibilité de développer des complications en rapport avec le Covid-19. Ensuite, on espérait que le climat chaud représentait un autre paramètre favorable qui rendait le virus moins pernicieux. On en doute fortement aujourd'hui car il a continué de sévir dans nos pays même en été. Enfin, il faut prendre en compte toute la problématique de la capacité de comptabilisation administrative des cas, certains pays n'ayant pas des structures administratives adéquates. Donc on manque de données suffisantes. Mais ce qui est certain, c'est que la plupart de ces pays manquent cruellement des moyens sanitaires et hospitaliers susceptibles de faire face à ce type de menaces, et surtout que la crise mondiale engendrée par cette pandémie va se généraliser et aura inéluctablement des répercussions potentiellement dramatiques dans ces pays également. À cela va s'ajouter la diminution des envois de fonds des diasporas installés dans les pays dits développés, une manne essentielle pour certains pays pour simplement permettre aux personnes de survivre. D'après nos informations, la famine touche comme toujours de très nombreux pays. Pour toutes les raisons déjà mentionnées, on assiste à une dégradation de la situation des conditions de vie dans les pays d'origine des migrants, avec bien entendu un cercle vicieux qui s'emballe. Plus il y aura de gens mourant de faim, de difficultés et d'insécurité, plus il y aura de migration, plus il y aura de drames. Ces pays ont un besoin crucial d'un maintien d'une aide financière, d'une coopération des pays développés à leur égard. Cela pourrait passer par l'allègement de leurs dettes, par exemple. C'est fondamental, car autrement on risque d'avoir une dégradation de la situation. Tout cela en tenant compte également de l'évolution des problèmes climatiques qui d'office vont également aggraver les choses à court et moyen terme. Il y a tout de même de bonnes nouvelles dans toute cette histoire, car de bonnes pratiques et un engagement à la hauteur des défis ont été constatés dans de très nombreux pays. Souvent, par exemple, il a été renoncé à l'usage de la détention administrative pour les migrants, car on s'est rendu compte que maintenir dans la promiscuité des personnes qui ne sont pas des criminels puisqu'ils sont juste là dans l'attente d'une détention administrative, c'était leur faire courir un risque supplémentaire de contracter la maladie. L'Espagne, le Portugal ou la Grande-Bretagne se sont distingués dans ce domaine. On doit également souligner que dans nombre de pays, les collectivités locales ont apporté un soutien sanitaire essentiel et très apprécié à l'égard des migrants. Il y a également eu un engagement sans faille de nombreuses ONG, membres de la société civile. Après une accalmie temporaire, on est en ce moment dans la crainte de l'installation progressive de la très crainte deuxième vague. C'est très important pour tous nos États de prendre en compte les résultats des derniers mois de la crise afin d'en tirer les conclusions pour être prêts à prendre les mesures adéquates pour protéger leur population, mais sans oublier les migrants, les réfugiés et les demandeurs d'asile. Pour conclure, je voudrais simplement ajouter qu'en cette période, il nous est constamment rappelé de porter un masque, de garder nos distances et de nous laver les mains. En tant que médecin, je ne peux être que d'accord. Cependant, concernant les migrants, les réfugiés et les demandeurs d'asile, je vous demande de ne pas vous laver les mains de leur situation, de ne pas garder vos distances quand il s'agit de leur apporter de l'aide et de ne pas oublier les États aux frontières sud de l'Europe qui sont sous pression pendant cette période de crise. Nous devons faire preuve de solidarité avec toutes celles et tous ceux qui sont touchés par cette pandémie, sans exception, et particulièrement envers les plus vulnérables, à savoir les migrants, réfugiés et demandeurs d'asile, ainsi que leur pays d'origine. Pour terminer, un grand merci au secrétariat de la Commission des migrations pour l'appui essentiel qu'ils m'ont apporté, ainsi que pour les autres membres de la Commission pour leur contribution. Je vous remercie pour votre attention.
Thanks, Mr. Friedex. The floor is now open for discussions. Who wishes to take the floor? I first give the floor to the representative of the political groups. So I first call Madame Sibel Arslan from the Socialist Group and from Switzerland. You have the floor. Madame Sibel Arslan, can you hear us? You have the floor.
So, Mr. President, do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you perfectly.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Geschätzte Kollegen und Kolleginnen, ich erlaube mir, auf Deutsch zu sprechen. Wir möchten uns als Fraktion für die außerordentlich guten Berichte bedanken. Die Pandemie hat uns alle schwer getroffen. Einige Menschen hat sie aber schwerer und in mehrfacher Hinsicht getroffen. Die erlassenen Maßnahmen haben die strukturellen Ungleichheiten verschärft. So leisten Frauen einen wichtigen Beitrag in der Care-Arbeit. Sie sind von der Altersarmut stärker betroffen. Sie erleben häusliche Gewalt und kein Tag vergeht, an der nicht eine Frau wegen häuslicher Gewalt ihr Leben verliert. In der Quarantäne verschärft sich diese tragische Problematik. Klar sind es nicht nur Frauen, aber sie sind in der Mehrzahl. Aus dieser Resolution oder mit dieser Resolution können wir auf die Probleme und den Handlungsbedarf aufmerksam machen. Auch die Diskriminierung aus Gründen des Geschlechts, der nationalen und ethnischen Herkunft, einer Behinderung des Alters, der sexuellen Orientierung, der Geschlechtsidentität hat sich in allen Bereichen des täglichen Lebens verstärkt. Die wichtigen Schritte zur Gleichstellung werden angegriffen und teils sogar rückgängig gemacht. Aktuell, habe ich vorher auch erwähnt, in meiner Frage dürfen unverheiratete Paare zum Beispiel ihre Partnerinnen in anderen Ländern nicht besuchen und deshalb braucht es hier Rahmenbedingungen. Mehrfachbelastung in der Krise haben auch Migrantinnen, Geflüchtete, Asylsuchende und besonders die unbegleiteten Minderjährigen. Durch die irreguläre Migration, Fluchtsituation und Unterbringung der Asylsuchenden sind sie mit langen und gefährlichen Reisen konfrontiert, sind längere Zeit in Haft und müssen unter verheerenden Bedingungen leben. Die Gefahr der Ansteckung, haben wir auch gehört, ist viel größer. Wir haben es gestern seitens der OECD gehört, dass das BIP in der nächsten Zukunft abnehmen wird. Die Konsequenzen werden die Herkunftsländer härter treffen als die vergleichsweise stabilen volkswirtschaftlichen Europas. All dies wird erhebliche zusätzliche Migrationsdruck und Fragen der Migrationssteuerung mit sich bringen. Aus langzeitstrategischen Gründen dürfen wir nicht zulassen, dass gewisse Gruppen als Sündenböcke dargestellt werden. Es braucht eine größere Solidarität mit den Entwicklungsländern, sei dies in Form von Schuldenerlass oder in der Aufrechterhaltung oder gar der Ausbau der Entwicklungszusammenarbeit. Deshalb anerkennen wir als Fraktion der Sozialisten, Demokraten und Grünen den Handlungsbedarf, wollen Verantwortung übernehmen und werden folglich die beiden Resolutionen unterstützen. Besten Dank.
Thank you, Madame Sibel. And from the Liberal Group, Madame Fiona O'Loughlin from Ireland, you have the floor right now. Madame Laughlin from Ireland. Okay, here we are.
Yeah, my apologies. The technology is not working so great. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm a new member of the council, so it's a great privilege to be among your esteemed company and to have the opportunity to say a few words on the two reports. And it's very timely that today is my time to say a few words in relation to COVID and how it has impacted on us. We have our national annual budget today and are certainly hoping that some of the vulnerable groups that have been spoken about will be looked after with some of the measures that will be included. And can I thank the two rapporteurs for their very thought-provoking reports that they have given to us, and certainly on behalf of my party, my grouping, the ALDE grouping, and of course the Irish delegation, I'm very happy to support, and particularly in relation to the call for action in relation to what we need to do. As Petra mentioned, the balancing act for all of our governments is very, very difficult because it's hugely important to protect public health of all of our citizens, and obviously we have to uphold human rights also. And I agree that we have to learn from the pandemic and all of the challenges that it posed for us. And, you know, when I look back about our experience here in my own country, definitely those that were in nursing homes, the refugees and migrants in direct provision, those in lower paid, people who've come from other countries and were working in low paid jobs such as our meat factories, they certainly were very much impacted by COVID and didn't get the supports that others would have done. And some of my colleagues have mentioned the whole area of domestic violence. And again, there was a huge increase. We've seen that, and very, very difficult for women to have to stay in lockdown measures with the perpetrators and, of course, for their children. We have to ask, I think, if we were starting this all over again, what measures would we have put in place to support those that were more vulnerable? And, you know, I think, you know, by their very nature, the COVID-19 restrictions have impinged on the basic rights that any of our citizens expect in a modern, forward, you know, thinking Europe and in our own democracies. You know, when in Ireland, when we brought in our first restrictions, the restrictions to rights to liberty and movement and association, they were for a very limited period of time. But now we find we're in a situation because of the second wave right across Europe that it's very, very difficult. And I think that while our restrictions have to be limited and monitored, it's also vitally important that the impact of COVID-19 on vulnerable groups is mitigated. And so I know my time is up, Chair, but I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak and to absolutely support and endorse the two rapporteurs and their reports and recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Madame Fiona. And now from United Left, Madame Rosa Brynjolfsdóttir from Iceland, you have the floor.
Dear colleagues, I want to thank the rapporteurs for their excellent reports, and I agree with the Commissioner for Human Rights. These reports are timely and extremely necessary. As stated in Ms. Stiernen's report, the crisis has cast a harsh spotlight on structural inequalities already present in our societies. We already know that the groups most affected from the COVID-19 are marginalized groups, as those that the two reports are covering. And as mentioned in Ms. Stiernen's report, lockdown measures increase the risk of gender-based and domestic violence and discrimination on grounds of gender, national or ethnic origin, disability, age, sexual orientation, etc. has been amplified, and progress towards equality has been set back. Manifestation of racism and prejudice have also increased. And I fully agree with the rapporteur on the effect of gender on gender equality and non-discrimination. The discriminatory effects of the pandemic will not disappear overnight. If we do not respond to the lessons we have learned, these effects will persist, and those most harmed will be hardest hit by the next one. Therefore, I, on behalf of my political group, support the recommendation in both reports that urges Member States to strengthen measures to address existing structural inequalities and to mainstream equality issues into the response work to the COVID-19. And I agree with Ms. Steenan that we must act now to transform our societies and overcome the inequalities that are so deeply rooted in them. The same goes with Mr. Fide's report that so rightly states that vulnerable groups, such as migrant, refugees and asylum seekers, are often the first to suffer and are doubly affected in situations of crisis. Migrants, refugees and asylum seekers have also faced many additional problems during this pandemic, closing of borders, longer and more perilous journeys at a time when search and rescue at sea has been curtailed. The increased risk of pushback and disembarkation has become a bone of political contention. Irregular migrants and asylum seekers have also had to face prolonged periods of detention in cramped conditions. Dear colleagues, in times of crisis, basic human rights of refugees and asylum seekers that are already regularly violated are also further jeopardized, either through simple neglect or through the settings of priorities by hard-stretched authorities. Already substandard living conditions will become worse as movement is restricted. And the most vulnerable among those people in vulnerable situations are children, women, and the physically and mentally ill. And migrant children are in more vulnerable situation than ever during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we see in Mr. Fide's report that the Venice Committee urged state parties to ensure that all children must be confined in safe environments. And the report urges member states to especially ensure the safety of separated and unaccompanied children. The pandemic has shown that in times of crisis and catastrophe, migrants and especially migrant women and children must benefit from the same protection as national. And this is not just in the interest of migrants, but in the interest of us all. We must all agree that solidarity among countries is essential in dealing with the pandemic, especially when it comes to safeguarding the human rights of the most vulnerable groups of our societies. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Rosa. And from European Conservative Group, I give the floor to Sir Roger Gale from the United Kingdom.
Conservative Group thank Petra Steenan and Pierre-Alain Friedrich for their hard work in generating these reports. Two very important issues. The point has been made several times, I think, and most of us have experienced this as constituency members of parliament in our own countries, that the effects of lockdown and the inevitable restriction of movement of families has meant a rise in violence, domestic violence. Generally, as has been said, that's directed towards women, but not exclusively. There are occasions when men have found themselves suffering as well. It's a very real side product of a very grim circumstance that affects us all. One of the other rather bizarre and unpleasant side effects of this has been that the cross-channel migrant traffic from Calais to Dover, or across the Dover Straits, has been increased dramatically, partly because of the fine weather, but also because illegal migrants have sought to stow away in lorries generally, or of course to fly into the United Kingdom by plane. With the curtailment of both of those routes, many more migrants have resorted to the use of, very dangerous use, of rubber dinghies to try and cross the channel. That in turn has generated the grim possibility for the hard right to go down, take photographs and say, stop this filthy practice. It's an extremely unpleasant aspect of, I'm afraid, British life that we personally, I think, all abhor. We do have to control migration, and particularly illegal immigration. But this sort of protest is quite unacceptable in any, I believe, in any civilized country. The other thing that we've had